Peter, maybe it's time the world knows what we've been hiding for the last 30 years. Patrick said that, right there at our father's funeral. The church bell echoed through the air. Mourners bowed their heads in silence. And then he laughed. A low, broken laugh that sliced straight through my chest. I froze. The air turned heavy. And in that single moment, everything I'd ever built, every belief, every sacrifice, came crashing down. All eyes turned to me. Whispers started to spread. Someone pulled out a phone, recording. Patrick looked over, that cold, deliberate smile curling on his lips. Your legacy isn't real, Peter. Just like you. I don't remember how I left that ceremony. Only the rain, sharp against my face, and the image of a boy kneeling beside me decades ago, promising, "We'll always be brothers." That promise, torn to shreds, along with my dignity. I never imagined one sentence, spoken in the rain that night, would unravel a web of guilt, deceit, and betrayal that had been buried beneath the word family for 3 decades. And if you think the worst thing in life is being betrayed, stay. Because what I'm about to tell you is far crueler than betrayal itself. My name is Peter Hayes, 52 years old, an architect who spent his life raising towers that touched the skyline, yet couldn't stop the house that mattered most from collapsing from within. People call me a perfectionist. Cold. Distant. What they don't know is that I was once a boy who used to hide behind his little brother whenever thunder rolled across the sky. Patrick and I grew up by Maple Lake, in a small wooden cabin our father built after our mother passed. I was 13, he was 8. Two skinny boys at a funeral, gripping each other's hands as if the world might split in half. Patrick trembled. I whispered to him, "It's okay. I'll protect you." Mom would want us to stay together, always. From that day on, we were inseparable. I was the quiet one, the diligent one. Patrick was bright, quick, charming. He could make our father laugh even on the hardest days. We spent our summers by the lake, building model houses out of sticks and cardboard. Patrick painted. I measured. Those were the best years of my life. Patrick once told me, "When you become an architect and I'm an investor, we'll build a whole city together, son. Call it Mother's Haven, so she'll always be remembered." I believed him, completely. When our father opened a small construction firm, Patrick studied finance to help manage the business, while I handled the designs. Things took off faster than we imagined. Within a decade, we'd expanded across several states. People began to talk about the Hayes brothers, the perfect balance of vision and precision. Our father used to say, "You're two wings of the same bird. Lose one, and the bird will fall." I didn't know then that those words would haunt me for the rest of my life, because one wing eventually grew jealous of the other. After our father died, Patrick began to change. At first, it was subtle. He stopped calling me brother, started using Peter. He'd interrupt me in meetings, dismiss my ideas, stare at me with a look that wasn't anger, but something colder, resentment. I told myself it was stress, pressure from running the business. I refused to doubt him because I owed him my entire childhood, a childhood I wouldn't have survived without Patrick. But there are moments that stay burned into your memory, moments that whisper truths you don't want to hear. Like the day I walked into our father's office just a week after the funeral. The safe was wide open. Patrick sat in front of it, staring at the stack of old documents inside. I asked quietly, "What are you looking for?" He didn't turn around. "Just trying to see what in here truly belongs to us. Us." I didn't realize it then, but that word had already changed its meaning. After our father's funeral, Patrick was no longer the brother I knew. He started dressing with a sharp, almost sterile precision, his voice clipped, his gaze distant, like there was a thin sheet of ice behind his eyes. He practically moved into our father's office, saying he needed to go through the files. But I knew what he was really doing, reclaiming control. I tried to ignore it. I wanted to believe family meant more than pride, that no matter how much Patrick changed, I would always be his brother, and that brotherhood could heal anything. But I was wrong. One night, I came home late from a business trip. The light in our father's study was still on. When I walked in, Patrick was standing by the open safe. Files were neatly stacked inside, but it wasn't the papers that chilled me. It was the look in his eyes. He didn't flinch. Didn't hide. He just turned slightly and asked quietly, "Ever wonder why Dad always trusted you more than me?" I said nothing. Then he added, "I found the answer. It's in here." He brushed his fingers over the folders, and in that brief motion I saw something flicker across his face, a mix of anger and satisfaction. I didn't understand, didn't dare to. A moment later, the heavy door of the safe closed with a dull, final thud, a sound that felt like the end of our childhood. After that night, Patrick grew distant. He started attending board meetings without me, calling investors behind my back, whispering about the things Dad never told us. Once I overheard him on the phone, his voice low and trembling with rage. "No, he's been lying for decades. I have proof. I'm just waiting for the right time." The right time, those two words knotted my stomach, but I stayed silent. I held on to faith, the kind that blinds you. Faith that no matter what happened, he was still my brother. We'd shared loss, a roof, a name. We'd promised, nothing will ever come between us. But now, every time I looked at him, a quiet dread began to grow, the kind of dread that comes before a storm. And that storm finally broke, on the day of our father's funeral. In front of hundreds of mourners, Patrick smiled, that same calm, cutting smile, and said, "It's time the world knows what we've been hiding." With one sentence, 30 years of love, loyalty, and childhood memories shattered like glass. I still don't know what he found inside that safe. What truth, or lie, was powerful enough to twist love into hatred. But I know this. From that moment on, our bond was no longer a shelter. It became a battlefield. The press conference took place on a gray Monday morning in the glass atrium of Hayes Sons headquarters. I hadn't been told a thing. When the elevator doors slid open, I was met with a sea of reporters, cameras flashing, microphones jutting forward like a forest of spears. Behind the podium, our company logo, a two-winged bird, gleamed against the backdrop, and standing beneath it, basking in the lights like a man born for the stage, was Patrick. He adjusted the microphone, smiling a smile I'd never seen before, calm, confident, and laced with something venomous. "Thank you all for being here," Patrick began, his tone measured and magnetic. "Today I have a truth to share, a truth buried for 30 years. I froze a few steps away. My assistant whispered, "Sir, do you still want to go in?" I drew a breath. "Let me handle this." I stepped through the wall of lenses, stopping near the marble staircase that overlooked the crowd. My heartbeat pounded as I spotted a brown envelope in a red-stamped folder on the table in front of the podium. The label read, "Biological Record, Confidential." Patrick began his story, polished, emotional, rehearsed. He painted our childhood by Maple Lake, two brothers, a widowed father, a legacy built from love and hardship. The audience hung on every word until he cut the story open. "But," he paused, glancing my way, "not everything is as we've told it." The room fell silent. "My brother, Peter Hayes," he enunciated every syllable, "is not my father's biological son. His birth certificate was altered." 100 flashes went off at once. Questions erupted. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Patrick raised a hand for silence, then opened the envelope. He held up 2 birth certificates, one old, yellowed, one newer. Different names, different father. Then, from the folder, he produced a DNA test stamped with an official seal. "These are the results from an independent lab," he said smoothly. "Conclusion, no direct genetic relation." A woman in the third row gasped. The clicking of cameras stopped, then fired again like gunshots. I stepped forward, my voice barely holding. "Patrick, what are you doing?" He met my eyes, steady, unblinking. "Telling the truth you've been avoiding your entire life." I wanted to laugh, but my throat was steel. "Those documents are fake." He gave a half shrug, feigning pity. "Then why did father never release his final will? Why did he transfer most of his shares years ago? Not to you, but to a temporary guardian. Strange, isn't it?" He turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have bank receipts showing suspicious payments connected to a hospital's records office 30 years ago. And this," he opened his laptop. The projector screen behind him lit up. "This is a scan of my father's journal, his handwriting. If the truth comes out, everything will fall apart. Peter must never know." Gasps rippled through the room like a hive of bees. My head buzzed, but deep down I knew my father would never have written words like that. He was a man of silence, not accusation. Those lines reeked of forgery. Stop. I stepped toward the podium. Two security guards moved to block me, but Patrick lifted a hand. Let him through. Face to face, I looked into my brother's eyes, and behind the calm, I saw something dark and bottomless. What do you want? I asked quietly. Justice, he said, then smiled. And the seat that should have been mine. The atrium seemed to collapse into silence. I understood then. This wasn't revelation, it was execution. A plan forged the night I caught him by our father's safe, his hand resting on a wound he could never let heal. I turned to the press, my voice steadier than I expected. I'll release my father's original handwritten letters, and 8mm footage from our lakeside home, filmed in 1995, where he spoke about our family himself. A reporter shot back, "Are you saying all this is fake?" "I'm saying," I met the camera's head on, "this is a performance, and I'll prove it." Patrick didn't argue. He didn't need to. He knew this blow was enough to make me stagger. He leaned against the podium, delivering the final strike. Until the truth is verified, as acting chairman, I'm temporarily suspending Peter Hayes from his duties to ensure full transparency for our shareholders. The words hit like a hammer. Board members who'd congratulated me that morning now stared down at their phones. A silent exile, executed in public. When it was over, the lobby turned into a swamp of murmurs and microphones. As I slipped through the crowd, I caught fragments. If he's not blood, why keep the Hayes name? Whose legacy is it really? They weren't searching for truth. They were searching for someone to blame. Outside, summer rain began to pour without warning. I stood beneath the glass awning, watching my reflection blur in the puddles. Across the street, Patrick stepped into a black car. He didn't look back. That's when I knew. The game had begun. And if I wanted to survive, I couldn't just be the architect of buildings anymore. I'd have to become the architect of the truth. Brick by brick, word by word, memory by memory, before my brother built a prison of lies around my life. 2 days after the press conference, my name was plastered across every headline. Hayes' son's CEO accused of falsifying identity. Brother not blood-related, who really owns a $200 million legacy? Those words cut like knives, slicing away at the pride I'd spent a lifetime building. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Clients, reporters, lawyers. Nobody asked if I was hurting. Patrick had vanished from the company, but his fingerprints were everywhere. Leaked documents, shareholders suddenly turning chilly, anonymous social accounts dropping so-called confidential files about the Hayes family. I knew this. If I couldn't find the truth, I'd lose everything. Not just my reputation, but the Hayes name itself, the inheritance Dad left like a code of honor. That night, I went to see Alan, Dad's longtime lawyer. Old, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who'd watched my father sign the first contracts of the company. I asked him straight, "Alan, is what Patrick says true? Am I not Dad's son?" He looked at me for a long moment, then poured a drink. "Peter," he said quietly, "some truths are hidden not because they're shameful, but because the world isn't ready for them." I tightened my voice. "I'm ready." "Tell me." Alan sighed, opened his briefcase, and took out a worn file dated 1992, the year Mom died. Inside were hospital records, letters, and a note written in my father's hand. "Peter, my dear, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here to explain. You were born of my blood, but to protect you from those who harmed your mother, I had to alter the paperwork. There are people who would destroy our family. All I ask is that when you learn everything, you still choose forgiveness." My hands trembled. The ink was faded, but the line, "You were born of my blood," burned like a brand. My father had not lied. Patrick was twisting the story. "Who has the original records?" I asked. "A copy is kept in St. Mercy Hospital's archives," Alan said. "But Peter, Patrick acquired that hospital 3 months ago through a shell company, Marlin Corp." I gripped the arm of the chair. Pieces snapped into place. Patrick rifled through Dad's files after the funeral. He'd been prowling the hospital records. He'd been planning the press conference. Every move fit into a premeditated pattern. I stood and looked out the window. Our building glowed across Wall Street, once a symbol of the Hayes name's pride. Now its lights felt like an accusation, a spotlight on the betrayal growing inside our family. I spoke softly to myself. If Patrick wants to play with lies, I'll answer with the truth. Alan nodded. Truth doesn't save itself. You need someone brave enough to show it. That night, I drove back to the cabin on Maple Lake, the place where everything began. The house was cold and nearly derelict, but tucked in a corner of an old cabinet was Dad's 8mm camera. I plugged it in. The red rec lamp blinked alive. The reel inside was never developed. When the film ran, my father appeared on the screen, seated with a young Patrick on his knee. His voice was warm and steady. Patrick, you are my pride. But never forget, Peter is your brother. He is our blood. The reel cut off before it finished, but that single clip was enough. It was the first crack in the facade Patrick had built, the first tangible proof I could point to. From that moment, I stopped being just the accused. I became the strategist of my own counterattack. I would not let a manufactured scandal steal everything my father and I had built together. If Patrick wanted to wage war with forged documents and planted narratives, I would respond by reconstructing the truth, piece by piece. Original letters, old film, witnesses who remembered the man my father was. No more silence, no more hiding. The next moves would be deliberate, quiet, and precise. I was no longer merely an architect of buildings. I had to become an architect of facts, rebuilding the narrative around me before Patrick could lock me inside the prison he'd started to build with his words. Less than a week after the press conference, my house, once a haven of quiet, turned into a war zone of rumors, flashing cameras, and invisible questions. Reporters camped outside the gates. Neighbors avoided eye contact. My son, Ethan, 18, sensitive, brilliant, stopped going to school. He'd sit for hours without a word, staring at me with a look that mixed confusion and disgust. That night I came home late. The front door was ajar. The living room lights were dim. On the coffee table lay a folded newspaper, my photo printed beneath the headline, Peter Hayes, the man who lived a lie. Across from it sat my wife, Laura, her face pale with exhaustion. She didn't look up when she said softly, I don't know what to believe anymore, Peter. I dropped the paper onto the table, forcing my voice to stay calm. Believe me, Patrick staged everything. I have proof. I just need time. She gave a hollow laugh. Time? The whole world thinks you're a fraud, a man who stole another's name. Our son's being mocked online, and you want me to wait? I took a step closer, wanting to hold her, but she stepped back, her voice breaking. I love you, Peter, but I can't live in a house where every channel shows your face as a liar. The door closed behind her, not with a slam, but a soft, clean finality, the kind of sound that leaves a scar. I stood in the silence, surrounded by relics of a life that had already left me. Our wedding photo still hung on the wall. The smiles of 20 years ago now looked like a cruel joke. Ethan appeared on the staircase, suitcase in hand. I'm going with Mom, he said quietly. When everything's clear, maybe I'll come back. I grabbed his hand. You have to trust me. I never... He pulled away, eyes wet. If you're telling the truth, why does everyone else have proof and you only have words? When the door shut again, I sank to my knees. 2 doors closed in one night, and my world disappeared with them. The next day, Patrick went on national television, a 10-minute special report, complete with photos, documents, even recordings he claimed were of our father's final confession. The broadcast played an elderly man's voice, weak and trembling. Peter must never know. He is not my blood. But I knew instantly. That voice wasn't my father's. It was eerily close, yes, but something was off. Too dry, too mechanical. Patrick had cloned his voice. The country exploded. Shareholders called emergency meetings. My accounts were frozen. Every contract I'd signed was suspended overnight. Alan, my lawyer, phoned at midnight. Peter, he's using deepfake technology. If he's gone that far, you need hard evidence. Give me the original video in your father's letter. Right now. I drove straight to the lake house. The wind howled through the pines. The moon fractured across the water. Inside, I pulled open the old cabinet and took out the 8mm film. But when I pressed play, the screen showed nothing but static. White noise, black dots, fragments of faces breaking apart. The reel had been cut. Someone had been here. I dropped to the floor, breath shallow. Patrick wasn't just trying to destroy me. He was erasing the truth itself. That night, I drove back to the city under sheets of cold rain, streetlights smeared into golden streaks across the windshield. In the reflection, faces flickered. My father, my mother, Patrick, Laura, Ethan, every person I'd ever loved, dissolving one by one. Only the truth remained. Naked, fragile, alone. I whispered to myself through the sound of rain against glass. If this is hell, then I'll burn with it, but I won't burn alone. I didn't yet know how, but I knew one thing for certain. Patrick wasn't just testing how far I could fall, he was testing whether I could rise again. And I swore the next time we stood face to face, I wouldn't be the man cornered by lies anymore. I'd be the man who turned them into his weapon. I didn't sleep for 3 days. My office became a hurricane of paper, old tapes, USB drives, photocopies of Dad's letters. I froze every frame I could salvage from the ruined reel, each still image a blur of my father's face, like someone trying to speak through the roar of a storm. Alan arrived with a battered external drive in hand. I had a digital forensics team work on the tape, he said. They found something Patrick didn't expect. He hooked the drive to my laptop. The screen filled with static, then, slowly, the audio rose. Muffled at first, then unmistakable, my father's voice. Peter is my son, never doubt that. He needs to know the truth someday, but not now. I felt the room tip. Alan froze the frame and pointed to a tiny timestamp in the corner. That timestamp is the original, he said. It doesn't match what Patrick aired on TV. He edited the footage and rearranged the audio. My hands shook. The truth had crept out from under the rubble. All of it was staged, I said. Words alone won't win this, Alan replied. You need the originals, the raw files, the source that can stand up in court. The thought hit me. Dad had backed up company records on the old server, an internal archive only he and I had access to. After he died, I'd lost the password. But for Patrick to reconstruct this lie, he had to have used Dad's credentials. If I could get back in, I could prove the forgery. That night, I went to Hayes' Sons. Security recognized me, hesitated. The company directory still listed me as CEO, even if the press said otherwise, and let me through. The building was dark, corridors empty. A sliver of light bled from Patrick's office on the top floor. I moved like a shadow. My phone was recording. On Patrick's screen, lines of code, a server login prompt. He was alone, fingers moving fast. I hit record. Finally, he muttered to nobody but the monitor. Good, clean, no trace left of him. I pushed the door open. Deleting me from the company is easier than deleting the truth, Patrick, I said. My voice was cold, calm. He spun, white as paper, then smoothed his face and tried to recover control. What are you doing here? This building is under my authority now. No, I said. It's Dad's, and he just spoke. I plugged the recovered USB into the conference room screen and hit play. The room filled with my father's voice, clear, warm, irrevocable. Peter is my son. Never doubt that. Patrick stumbled back, the color draining from his face. For the first time since all this began, he looked small. You spent years calling me brother, I said, stepping closer. But you chose power over family. Now watch who's living the lie. He lunged for the keyboard for the screen, anything to stop it, but I'd already recorded everything. I handed the USB to Alan, who waited just outside and gave me a single, hard nod. Send this to the Herald Tribune and the Federal Council, I said, loud enough for Patrick to hear. No more hiding. He grabbed my arm. You're insane, Peter. If this gets out, the whole company collapses. It already collapsed the day you decided to betray your blood, I replied, and pulled free. Silence fell. Outside, thunder rolled, and rain began to hammer the windows like a second set of fists on the lies that had been built. Before I left, I paused at the doorway and leaned back to speak quietly. You've got 12 hours, I said. By then, the truth goes public. I'll do this not just to clear my name, but to remind the world. You don't get to build your power on the bones of someone else. Patrick didn't answer. He sank into the chair, hands clutching his head like a man watching the house he built out of cardboard disintegrate. I walked out into the storm. For the first time in months, fear loosened its grip. The cold rain hit my face hard and honest. It felt like waking up. This fight was only beginning. But I'd reclaimed the first brick. I'd fired the opening shot. And this time, I wasn't only defending my name, I was rebuilding the truth itself, one piece at a time. That morning, the headquarters of Hayes Sons was packed. Shareholders, employees, reporters, all crammed into the glass atrium where Patrick had called a meeting to announce his so-called new direction for the company. I knew what it really was, his final move to erase me completely, to declare, officially, that I had stepped down willingly. But he didn't know I was coming back. When the elevator doors opened, flashes exploded like lightning. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Is that really him? I thought he was suspended. Someone said he has evidence. Patrick stood at the podium, crisp suit, perfect posture, his tone calm to the point of parody. When the truth is distorted, he said, we must chart a clear path forward. I, Patrick Hayes, will continue to lead the company my father built, to preserve our family's honor. Every eye turned as I walked down the aisle. Patrick froze for a second, then smiled, that same polished, poisonous smile. Oh, you came, he said lightly. I thought you were taking some time off. I looked around the hall, then spoke slowly. No, Patrick. I came to remind them what father actually left us. Alan joined me, laptop and USB in hand. I nodded to the tech crew. The massive screen behind the stage flickered on. White letters appeared. Original footage unedited. The room went silent. Then on screen, the old cabin by Maple Lake. Our father sat between two young boys, Patrick and me. His voice filled the hall, deep and steady. Peter is my son. Both of you, no matter what the world says, are of my blood. If someday the world tries to divide you, remember this. Only love can keep this family standing. The words hit like a blade turned back on its wielder. A hush fell. Some of the staff began to cry. Patrick stood rigid, color draining from his face. I stepped forward, voice low but unwavering. This is the original footage, restored directly from my father's 8mm reel, timestamp verified, authenticated by an independent forensic team. Alan laid out the official documents, stamped and sealed. Camera flashes erupted like gunfire. For months, I continued, someone twisted our history to seize what wasn't theirs, forged my father's words, fabricated lab reports, manipulated the press. But as my father once said, no building stands if its foundation is built on lies. The room was still. Patrick forced a laugh, trying to steady himself. You think a blurry old video proves anything? There are certified documents showing you're not his biological son, independent DNA labs. Alan cut in sharply. That independent lab was purchased 6 months ago by a shell company, Marlin Corp., registered director Patrick Hayes. Here's the signed record from the state registrar. Gasps swept the hall. Patrick's face drained of blood. I turned to the nearest camera, the live broadcast feed, and said clearly, the Hayes name doesn't belong to whoever carries it. It belongs to whoever lives worthy of it. Applause began, hesitant at first, then thunderous. Employees rose to their feet. Shareholders sat in stunned silence. Reporters surged forward with questions. Patrick stepped back, eyes darting, then quietly descended from the podium and disappeared into the crowd. I said nothing more. Instead, I turned toward the large portrait of my father hanging in the center of the lobby, the symbol of everything we were supposed to protect, and bowed my head. By noon, every news network had flipped the story. Leaked footage exposes truth. Patrick Hayes accused of forging DNA evidence to seize control of Hayes' sons. I didn't feel triumphant, just lighter, as if I'd finally taken my first breath after drowning. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Patrick, the brother who once laughed at our father's funeral, wouldn't go down that easily, and the next move would be darker. 2 days after the public showdown, the media exploded. Headlines screamed across every front page. The truth reversed. The elder brother is the legitimate heir. Patrick Hayes, financial prodigy or master forger? Clips from the meeting went viral, the moment Patrick stood frozen under the lights while the video of our father played behind him. One photo spread faster than I could have imagined. Patrick bowing his head, me standing before the image of Dad. The caption read, "When lies bow before the truth." I didn't share it. I didn't comment. I just stayed silent. Patrick didn't. 3 nights later, he appeared on BNN News, his voice unsteady, but his tone rehearsed. The materials presented by Peter Hayes show clear signs of tampering. This is a desperate attempt to salvage a ruined reputation. The host leaned forward. Do you have proof of that, Mr. Hayes? Patrick's smile twitched. Of course, my legal team is verifying the matter as we speak. That one vague sentence became a double-edged sword. By morning, BNN released their own investigation. Marlin Corp., the company behind the DNA lab, is directed by Patrick Hayes. They had the receipts, legal documents, transaction records, even internal audio files confirming his ownership. I didn't need to say a word. The internet did the rest. People began digging through his old interviews, pointing out contradictions, discovering that Patrick had quietly withdrawn millions from the company's charity fund to support financial transparency initiatives. Within 48 hours, he wasn't a respected businessman anymore. He was a national scandal. Then, a message arrived in my inbox. From Megan, Patrick's former assistant. Attached were screenshots of group chats between Patrick and a team of private lawyers, a step-by-step blueprint of the entire forgery. Delete the originals before anyone can restore them. If it leaks, call it a technical error. I stared at the screen, the words burning through me. Alan chuckled dryly beside me. He's dug his own grave, Peter. All we need to do now is push. We forwarded everything to the federal authorities. That night I received a call from the lead investigator. Mr. Hayes, we've got your files. But you should be careful. Someone's trying to liquidate company assets tonight. I knew instantly. Patrick was running. The next morning, the stock market bled red. Hayes' Sons shares plummeted 23%. Half the shareholders called to apologize, voices trembling. We trusted the wrong man, they said. I didn't blame them. I simply replied, don't apologize to me. Apologize to the man who built this company, my father. Patrick vanished from the media for 3 days. When he finally reappeared, he looked hollow, exhausted, a ghost of the man who once strutted under flashlights. I was deceived, he stammered on live TV. Someone gave me false information. I only wanted to protect my father's honor. No one believed him. Reporters pressed in. Then why did you drain the company's funds? Why did you sign falsified contracts? He couldn't answer. His hands trembled. Then, in full view of the cameras, he pulled off his microphone and walked out. For the first time, I saw my brother afraid, not of the law, but of exposure, of the moment the mask he'd worn for so long finally cracked, revealing the small, desperate man beneath it. But I knew better than to relax. This wasn't over. Patrick Hayes had always played long games, and I could feel it in my gut. Before justice caught up, he still had one last move left to play. Monday morning, Patrick showed up at the Hayes Sons building, flanked by 2 bodyguards and a team of lawyers. His face was gaunt, dark circles under his eyes, but his gaze still carried that brittle pride he refused to let die. Reporters swarmed the lobby. Rumors spread like wildfire. Patrick has new evidence against his brother. From the 3rd floor, I watched through the glass railing, the same atrium where, a year ago, we'd launched our final project together under our father's name. Now it had become an arena. Patrick stepped up to the podium, his voice rough but defiant. I know many believe I lied, he began, but today I bring the final truth, proof that Peter Hayes not only forged his identity, but embezzled company funds. A wave of gasps filled the room. My jaw tightened. He opened his laptop, projecting a list of emails and bank transfers, my name highlighted beside several international wire transactions. He looked straight into the cameras. These are verified statements from an overseas bank confirming Peter Hayes moved millions from corporate accounts into his personal fund. The reporters lunged forward. Alan, my lawyer, simply gave a cold, knowing smile. I stepped out from the crowd, my tone steady. That's interesting, Patrick. Maybe you can tell everyone how you got those internal emails. They're protected at the highest level. Only the executive team can access them. He faltered. Barely, but I saw it. Or did you forget that such access requires the CEO's credentials? I added quietly. My credentials? Which you used. The room froze. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Our security logs track every access attempt, I continued. And here, I held up a printed report, is the record showing that user, Patrick, Hayes logged into the main server at 2:17 a.m. yesterday from the Royal Gate Hotel. Alan plugged in a USB drive. The screen behind Patrick flickered, and the hotel's security footage appeared. There he was. Patrick, seated at his laptop, typing rapidly. Off camera, a receptionist's voice could be heard. Mr. Hayes, are you sure you want to use the company network to access internal systems? Patrick in the footage nodded, unaware he was being recorded. The crowd erupted. Gasps, shouts, camera flashes. Patrick's face drained of color. That's fake. You staged this, he shouted. Alan's reply was like ice. We have confirmation from the National Cybersecurity Division. Every trace leads back to your device. You illegally accessed the system and sent falsified emails under Peter's name. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward. Mr. Hayes, is it true you fabricated emails to frame your brother? Patrick didn't answer. His breathing quickened. He looked around wildly, then, in a burst of panic, ripped off his mic and bolted from the stage. Flashes popped like lightning as he disappeared through the crowd. I didn't feel triumph, only an ache deep in my chest. Even in his ruin, I still saw him. The boy by Maple Lake, the one who once whispered, "We'll always be brothers." But that boy was long gone. As the chaos swelled behind me, I walked out of the atrium, my voice calm but carrying through the noise. Justice doesn't need belief. It only needs time. By evening, federal investigators had officially opened charges against Patrick Hayes for evidence tampering and data fraud. For the first time in months, I lifted my head and looked at the Hayes Sons building, not as a place of betrayal, but as proof that truth, however late, always finds its way home. 3 weeks after that disastrous public confrontation, the name Patrick Hayes returned to every headline, but this time not as a businessman. The titles all looked the same. Patrick Hayes sued for evidence forgery and corporate embezzlement. I didn't read them with satisfaction. I just sat in my father's old office, staring out the window where the New York sky hung heavy and gray, like a sheet of ash. Alan walked in, carrying a thick folder, his tone calm and deliberate. The court has approved the asset freeze order, he said. Every account under Patrick Hayes and his shell company Marlin Corp. is officially locked. I nodded faintly. And the lawsuit? Filed this morning. Charges include falsifying records, financial manipulation, unauthorized access to corporate data systems, and defamation of character. I looked out over the skyline again. My voice came out rough. Alan, do you think my brother ever had a chance to save himself? Alan's reply was cold, certain. No one can be saved once they've chosen to betray their own blood, Peter. That afternoon, the story of the asset freeze hit the airwaves. Every financial network broke the news at once. Investigators confirmed Patrick Hayes transferred over $12 million from company accounts to an offshore fund under his own name. The transactions align with the same timeline as the release of falsified corporate records. The shareholders of Hayes Sons called an emergency meeting. No one spoke Patrick's name anymore, only silence, and the weight of their stares toward me. I rose from my seat, speaking slowly but clearly. None of us wanted this. But the truth must be defended, even if it costs us the blood of our own family. The room stayed silent. Camera shutters clicked as I signed the official complaint, sending the case to federal court. 3 days later, Patrick appeared on camera. He looked thinner, pale, his once polished voice cracked with fatigue. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said hoarsely. I only wanted to protect what was mine. I believe Peter took what belonged to me. But the public had stopped believing him. The forged documents, the doctored recordings, the hotel security footage, all of it had been laid bare. During the press conference, a reporter cut him off mid-sentence. Mr. Hayes, if you're innocent, why are there $12 million sitting in a Cayman Islands account under your name? Patrick froze. His hand clenched the microphone until his knuckles turned white. That afternoon, the federal court officially summoned him for questioning. He was forbidden to leave the state, all personal accounts frozen, every property temporarily seized pending investigation. Alan brought me a copy of the court's decision. I read it for a long time before whispering, Dad, I never wanted to take my brother to court, but this is the only way left to protect our family's name. A gust of wind rattled the window frame, shaking the old photo that hung beside my desk, the one of my father, Patrick, and me by Maple Lake. In the fading light, Patrick's face still wore that bright, innocent smile, the one I used to trust without question, and somehow, even with the indictment in my hands, a part of me still couldn't believe that smile now belonged to a man on trial for destroying everything our father built. 2 weeks after the asset freeze, the legal war between Patrick and me ignited across every major outlet. The press called it the Hayes War, a family tragedy steeped in money, pride, and betrayal. Patrick refused to stay silent. He hired one of the most notorious defense attorneys in New York, Cliff Mercer, known in the media as the man who never loses. Mercer appeared on national television with the kind of smirk only arrogance can buy. My client, Mr. Patrick Hayes, he said, is the victim of an internal conspiracy. The so-called evidence presented, including the video and financial records, shows clear signs of digital manipulation. The media storm reignited instantly. The public split in two. Some believed Patrick had been framed. Others thought he was just clawing for air before sinking for good. I stayed quiet. I knew Mercer's type. Slick, theatrical, brilliant with words, and dangerously overconfident. Alan chuckled as he watched the broadcast. "Let them talk," he said. "Every argument Mercer makes is just another rope tightening around Patrick's neck." The first hearing was held at the federal courthouse in Manhattan. Patrick sat across from me, pale, thinner, dressed in a black suit that hung loose on him. He tried to look composed, but his eyes betrayed him. Mercer rose to deliver his opening statement, voice booming through the courtroom. "Your Honor, we believe Mr. Peter Hayes abused his position to falsify company server data and falsely accuse my client of embezzlement." He held up a stack of documents, printed bank statements, and screenshots of emails. "These show that Peter Hayes transferred funds to a Singapore account under the name Crown Holdings. During the same period, my client was accused of unauthorized withdrawals." Murmurs spread through the room. Flashbulbs flickered like lightning. Alan stood calmly, as if he'd been waiting for this exact performance. "Your Honor," he said, "we request to verify that claim against the original bank data." He opened his laptop, connecting it to the projector. The screen filled with an international banking log, complete with timestamps and digital signatures. "Yes," Alan said evenly. "Crown Holdings received those funds, but the sender wasn't Peter Hayes. The true sender ID was Faye's admin, a compromised corporate account hacked from within Hayes' Sons. And the access origin," he pointed to the bottom of the log, "matches the same IP address traced to the Royal Gate Hotel, where Patrick Hayes illegally logged into the system that night." The room erupted. Patrick's face drained of color. I don't know anything about that," he stammered. Mercer tried to interject, his confidence cracking. "Your Honor, this data could have been—" The judge's gavel struck sharply. "Mr. Mercer, this information comes directly from the International Bank, verified by the Federal Financial Crimes Division. Unless you have new evidence, there's nothing left to argue." Mercer froze. Patrick stared at the floor, sweat beading at his temples. Alan leaned over and whispered to me, smiling faintly. "It's over, Peter. They just shot themselves in the foot." I looked at my brother, the same boy who once split a sandwich with me when we were kids, now trembling in front of a courtroom full of strangers. Victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like mourning. As the judge called for recess, Patrick bolted for the exit, muttering to Mercer in a shaken voice, "How did everything turn against me so fast?" Mercer's reply was cold, almost pitying. "Because, Patrick, lies don't get days off." The third hearing stretched over 11 exhausting hours. Patrick no longer looked like the man who once manipulated headlines with a smile. Each time a witness took the stand, another light seemed to fade from his eyes. Digital forensics experts testified that the father's voice video Patrick had released was a deep voice fabrication, and every suspicious financial transfer traced directly to his hidden Cayman Islands account. When the judge called for recess, Patrick rose slowly, his movements stiff, hollow. He turned toward me with a mix of hatred and despair. Then he spoke, his voice low, cracked. "You win, Peter. But before the court finishes, you should know, Father wasn't the saint you think he was." I said nothing. He stepped closer, whispering into my ear. "He kept a secret fund, millions. The real beneficiary's name was yours. When that comes out, you'll be the one on trial." I met his eyes and replied quietly, "If that's true, then reveal it. I'd rather face justice than live in lies. Like you." He froze. He hadn't expected I'd stopped being afraid, because he'd forgotten. Once a man loses everything, he becomes untouchable. 3 days later, the final session began. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, shareholders, strangers hungry for the verdict. Patrick sat hunched beside Mercer, his hands trembling, face ghostly pale. Allen stepped forward, voice steady and commanding. Your Honor, the plaintiff submits one final piece of evidence, a certified statement from Franklin International Bank confirming that the so-called secret fund the defendant mentioned belonged to Mr. Arthur Hayes, the father of both parties. He paused, then continued. The account was a trust, created for both brothers, with this condition written by Mr. Hayes himself. May only be opened if the two still trust one another. The courtroom fell silent. Patrick's eyes widened. Empty, stunned. I closed mine. For a brief moment, I could almost hear my father's voice again, soft but firm. If you two ever doubt each other, then everything I leave behind will mean nothing. Allen turned back to the judge. The defendant used his father's final act of love as a weapon, not realizing it was proof of his own betrayal. We asked the court to render judgment. The judge nodded, his tone sharp and decisive. After reviewing all evidence, the federal court finds the defendant, Patrick Hayes, guilty of evidence forgery, financial fraud, and defamation. The defendant is hereby stripped of all inheritance and corporate holdings in Hayes' Sons and will face criminal prosecution under U.S. Basis Code 344 for federal financial fraud. The room erupted, cameras flashing, voices rising like thunder. Patrick collapsed into his chair, face drained of color, eyes wide and vacant. His hands shook violently, trying to grasp at something that no longer existed. I stood, looked toward the bench, then turned to my brother. I forgive you, I said quietly. Not because you deserve it, but because Father would have wanted me to. Patrick's eyes filled with tears. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. As the officers moved in to cuff him, the metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the courtroom, sharp, final, the sound of years of deceit coming to an end. The case was over. The court restored full control of Hayes' Sons to me and officially cleared the family's name. That night I sat alone in my father's office, rain streaking the windows like silent witnesses. Outside the city glowed, alive, relentless, but inside there was only stillness. The kind of silence that justice leaves behind, cruel, but fair. 2 days after the verdict, New York woke to rain that wouldn't quit. The weather felt small compared to the blaze of headlines sweeping the nation. Every channel, every news site, every late-night panel had one name on repeat: Patrick Hayes, once a finance darling, now the face of a national scandal. I sat alone in my office, the city blurred beyond the glass, and watched the headlines flicker across my laptop. Patrick Hayes, the fallen icon. When blood becomes a weapon, the Hayes family betrayal. Peter Hayes, the man who restored the family name. The press that had turned its back on me months earlier now circled close, eager for interviews. They coined a nickname, the Unbreakable Architect. They traced the arc they loved best, the collapse, the clawback, the rise, and painted me as the calm center in a hurricane of lies. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt exhausted. Justice had come, yes, but it hadn't paid me anything for the cost. The next morning, the Herald Tribune ran a 12-page expose that swallowed the front page. The years of deceit, how Patrick Hayes built a house of lies. The lead photo was of my father, a small caption beneath it. A man who built an empire on trust, and the son who tried to burn it down. They laid everything out: the shell company Marlin Corp., the falsified DNA reports, the software that cloned our father's voice, bank records, signed affidavits, interviews with former employees who had watched the plot unfold from the inside. Each revelation had receipts attached, invoices, timestamps, internal memos, and each lie peeled away layer by layer until there was nothing left but raw shame. That night, Primetime America ran a segment with a somber anchor who looked as if he'd weathered the story's moral weight. The Hayes saga, he said, is a reminder that the cruelest betrayal rarely comes from an enemy. It comes from the people you trusted most. On social platforms, the verdict and courtroom clips ricocheted across feeds. A clip of me at the podium, my voice steady as I said, "I forgave him not because he deserves it, but because Father would have wanted that," exploded into millions of views in hours. Comments piled up like the tide. "He's stronger than steel." I wish my father had left me a legacy like that. This is the kind of justice that actually means something. And Patrick? He disappeared from the world of accolades. His name vanished from industry lists, his projects quietly shelved, partners who once toasted him severed ties. A magazine that had lauded him as Man of the Year ran the old cover again, scrawled across with red ink. From honor to conviction. That evening I got word. Patrick was being held in the Manhattan Detention Center, his health failing, contact with the press cut off. Alan turned to me and asked quietly, "Do you want to visit him?" I shook my head. "Not now," I said. "If he still wants to prove himself, my words don't matter. Let him live with what he's done." I stood at the window and watched the skyline. The buildings I had designed still lit against the rain. Part of me wanted vindication. Part of me only wanted him to understand what he'd lost. The headlines and the news cycles could celebrate the victory, but they wouldn't fill the empty places the scandal had carved out inside our home. So I sat with the silence and the glow of the city. The public had seen justice play out in broad daylight. The cameras had applauded, but the private cost, the meals missed, the nights my son slept on a friend's couch, my wife's slow retreat from our life, none of that made a headline. Justice had stepped into the light. Now the world watched to see if it could hold what it had found there. A week after the verdict, the press dug deeper, not into numbers or charges, but into the childhood of two brothers whose story had gripped the nation. The headlines no longer screamed about courtrooms or crimes. Now they asked a quieter, more haunting question. How did two boys raised under the same roof end up on opposite sides of truth? The New York Post ran a feature that stopped traffic. Its title, "Two Boys by Maple Lake, When One Chose Truth and the Other Chose Lies." The story opened with an old photograph. Patrick and me, ages 9 and 14, sitting on the wooden steps of our lake house, dirt on our faces, laughing over a popsicle stick model of a home we'd built together. The reporter wrote, "No one is born a betrayer. Perhaps tragedy began the moment Patrick felt left behind." They interviewed Grace, our former neighbor, the woman who looked after us after our mother died. On live television, her voice trembled. "Peter was always the protector. Patrick just wanted to be seen. He wanted to prove he could be stronger than his brother, but deep down he was just afraid of being forgotten." Her words echoed everywhere. For the first time, the public softened. Outrage turned to reflection, even pity. NBC Nightline aired a primetime special titled "The Hayes Legacy, The Family That Fell Apart." They replayed the moment from court when I'd said, "Family isn't blood, it's respect and trust." The documentary ended with a shot of me standing alone in the old lake house, holding my father's watch, the same one he'd worn in every memory worth keeping. The narrator's voice lingered over the final frame. In a world where money can buy almost anything, Peter Hayes proved that integrity cannot be sold. Within 24 hours, my inbox filled with over 10,000 messages. Strangers from every state wrote to say my story had pushed them to forgive a sibling, call an estranged parent, or simply tell the truth they'd been afraid to face. On social media, a new hashtag took flight, #BuildLikePeter. People began sharing photos of the buildings I'd designed, writing beneath them, "Built on truth, standing strong like Peter Hayes." Reading those words, I felt something tighten in my throat, not pride, but gratitude. Because maybe Father had been right all along. If something is built with integrity, it will never truly fall. Meanwhile, Patrick vanished into silence. From his detention cell, he filed an appeal, but no one believed him. His famed attorney, Cliff Mercer, withdrew from the case. Friends cut ties. Investors who once called him the young genius of Wall Street now denounced him publicly. One headline on Bloomberg read, "Patrick Hayes, the greatest stain in modern finance." Rumors said he'd fallen into deep depression. He refused to speak, spending hours staring at the one photograph allowed in his cell, our family portrait by Maple Lake. A guard later told a journalist, "Some nights, he just whispers to himself, 'Brother, I just wanted you to see me one more time.'" That quote spread like wildfire. Across the country, talk shows fell silent after replaying it. People stopped debating and started listening. The story of the Hayes brothers was no longer just a scandal of money and deceit. It had become something else, a mirror reflecting how far ambition can push love, and how forgiveness can still outshine the ruins left behind. That night, the Truth Hour aired live across the country, breaking its 10-year record for viewership. The headline was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened. Peter Hayes, the man who forgave the one who destroyed him. I sat alone in a single chair, beneath a wash of soft white light. Dozens of cameras faced me, and millions of eyes waited in the unseen dark beyond the screen. The host, Marianne Collins, spoke gently, as if afraid her words might reopen an old wound. After everything you've endured, the betrayal, the loss, the collapse of your name, how did you find it in yourself to say, "I forgive my brother"? For a few seconds I couldn't answer. Images flickered through my mind. Patrick trembling in the courtroom, Laura walking away amid the chaos, Ethan turning his back, my father smiling in that old grainy video. Finally I spoke. "Because I refuse to live as a prisoner of hatred," I said quietly. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of vengeance." The studio went still. You could hear the silence breathe. I drew in another slow breath and continued. Patrick was wrong, undeniably. But so was I. I let pride turn me into a stranger to my own brother. My father once told me, "You can build 1,000 towers, but if you can't keep one roof over your family, you've built nothing at all." It took me a lifetime to understand that. My voice cracked. Marianne lowered her microphone, eyes glistening. "If Patrick were watching this now," she asked softly, "what would you want to say to him?" I looked straight into the main camera, but I didn't see lenses or lights. I saw a dirt-smudged boy laughing beside me at Maple Lake, holding a tiny wooden house made of popsicle sticks. "Patrick, if you're listening," I said, my throat tight, "I don't need your apology. I just want you to live, to find the good that's still somewhere inside you. Because I still believe, when you learn how to love again, we won't be two enemies anymore, just two men who finally survived the same mistake." Tears fell before I even realized it, not from grief, but from release. The audience rose to their feet. Applause rippled through the studio like waves against glass. Marianne's voice trembled as she spoke. "Thank you, Peter Hayes. Thank you for reminding us that justice isn't an ending, it's where mercy begins." At that same moment, miles away inside the Manhattan Detention Center, a small television flickered with the same broadcast. Patrick sat on his metal cot, back against the wall, face hollowed by months of silence. The glow from the screen cast faint light over him as my words echoed through the cell. "I don't need your apology." His shoulders trembled, his eyes reddened. Something wet hit the cold concrete. Maybe a tear, maybe just the air thick with regret. His cellmate looked up from the lower bunk and asked quietly, "That him, your brother?" Patrick didn't answer. He just nodded once, lips pressed tight, as if opening them might let all the guilt escape in one unbearable rush. On screen, the final shot showed me walking out of the studio into the afternoon light, not triumphant, not broken, just free. And somewhere behind those gray concrete walls, Patrick watched that light fade from the screen. Then, for the first time in months, let himself smile. It was faint, fragile, but it was real. A smile stripped of arrogance, leaving only the quiet ache of too late understanding. That morning, New York was steel gray and frozen, the kind of cold that bites through the air like truth itself. Outside the United States District Court, Southern District of New York, cameras flashed through the fog. The last hearing of Hayes versus Hayes, 8 months of chaos, scandal, and heartbreak, was about to begin. I stepped out of the car in a black suit, clutching a small framed photo of my father. Alan walked beside me, steady as ever. "You don't need to win anything today, Peter," he murmured. "Justice already did, the moment you chose to forgive." I nodded, though my chest still felt heavy. Across the street, a transport van pulled up. The door opened with a metallic clank. Patrick stepped out, handcuffed, gaunt, pale. No designer suit, no flashbulbs in his favor, just a man who had finally run out of masks. Our eyes met for the first time since the Truth Hour aired. He said nothing. Neither did I. But in that silent instant, I saw it. The thing Father had prayed for. Patrick had finally learned how to bow before the truth. The courtroom was packed to the walls. Cold light poured down over the two opposing tables, turning the polished floor into a mirror of everything we'd lost. Judge Everett, who had presided over the case from the start, began in a low, solemn tone. Today, we close not just a financial trial, but a family tragedy. Sometimes, justice is not found in a verdict, but in the courage it takes to face oneself. Patrick sat hunched, trembling. Mercer, his once celebrated lawyer, was gone, replaced by a quiet public defender who placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. The judge turned toward him. "Mr. Patrick Hayes," he said, "do you wish to make a statement before sentencing?" The entire room went still. Cameras stopped moving. Patrick rose, unsteady but resolute. His voice rasped, thin but clear enough to cut through the silence. "Your Honor, and my brother." He turned to face me. His eyes glistened. "I lied. I forged. I betrayed. But it wasn't because I hated him. It was because I was afraid. Afraid he was right. Afraid to live in his shadow. Afraid to be forgotten. And that fear turned me into something I didn't recognize." I gripped the edge of my chair, my heart thudding hard enough to hurt. He drew a shaky breath and went on, voice breaking. "I know it's too late for apologies, but if my father can hear me, I remember now what he tried to teach us. That reputation can't save a soul. And that truth, no matter how cruel, is the only way to be free." By the time he finished, his words dissolved into tears. Someone in the gallery began to cry. Even the reporters lowered their cameras. Judge Everett looked toward me. "Mr. Peter Hayes, as the plaintiff, would you like to address the court before sentencing?" I stood, the courtroom blurring around me as I walked to the center. "Your Honor," I said softly, "I didn't come here to demand punishment. I came to confirm one thing, that justice isn't revenge. It's a chance to become human again." I turned to Patrick, my voice barely above a whisper. "I forgive you, Patrick. Not because you've earned it, but because Father wanted me to learn how to love, even when my heart is broken." Patrick broke down, shaking. The room fell into utter silence. Judge Everett paused, his hand resting on the gavel, eyes glassy. Then he spoke. "The court acknowledges the remorse of the defendant, Patrick Hayes, and the extraordinary grace of the plaintiff, Peter Hayes. However, justice must still be served. The court sentences Patrick Hayes to 6 years in federal prison and the forfeiture of all embezzled assets." Patrick nodded. No plea, no protest. A single tear slipped down his cheek, landing on the steel cuff around his wrist. As the officers approached, he turned once more, lips trembling, mouthing 2 silent words, "Thank you." And in the pale white light of that courtroom, for the first time in years, I no longer saw a rival or an enemy. I saw my brother, lost for so long, finally finding his way home through the wreckage of truth. 3 weeks after the final verdict, the noise finally faded. The headlines stopped screaming. The cameras disappeared. America, it seemed, had decided to let the Hayes story rest. But for me, it wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something else. When I returned to the company after nearly a year away, the skyscraper stood tall and silent, like a soldier who had survived a long, brutal war. As I stepped into the lobby, hundreds of employees lined the marble floor, eyes fixed on me. No one spoke. Then, from the front row, a young woman whispered, her voice trembling, "Welcome home, Mr. Hayes." Applause broke out, soft at first, then swelling like a wave rolling through the hall. I bowed my head, not in triumph but in gratitude, because I knew this company hadn't survived because of me. It had survived because people still believed that truth, fragile, battered truth, was worth holding on to. A few days later, I stood once more beneath the great logo my father designed, the twin-winged bird of Hayes Sons. For the company's official relaunch, cameras flashed, reporters waited. I took a breath and began. "My father used to say, a building can collapse, but honor never should. Today isn't about rebuilding the past, it's about building the future, not with steel or glass, but with honesty." The room rose to its feet. In the last row, I caught sight of my son, Ethan. His expression was different this time, not distant, not ashamed. When the ceremony ended, he came to me without a word and wrapped his arms around me. For the first time in years, I felt the warmth of a home returning to my chest. A week later, a letter arrived at my office. It was thick, handwritten, the ink uneven, but I knew the handwriting instantly. It was from Patrick. "Dear Peter, I've gone 3 nights without sleep before writing this. They say silence is the companion of guilt. but I think silence is also where you finally start hearing yourself. I heard you, Peter, on that show talking about forgiveness, about home, about father. I cried, not out of regret, but because I realized you were still holding a place for me, even after I burned the house down. Every morning, the sunlight hits the bars in my cell, and I think of that light in the courtroom, the one that fell on your face when you said, "Justice isn't punishment, it's the chance to be human again." You were right. Justice gave me a sentence, but you gave me a reason to live it. By then, my hands were shaking too hard to turn the page. The final lines blurred through my tears. If I ever get out, I want to rebuild the lake house at Maple, not to live in, but to give us a place to come back to. If you're reading this, all I ask is that you don't forget, I was once your brother. Patrick. I folded the letter carefully and placed it between 2 pages of my father's journal. That night, I drove to Maple Lake. The air was cool and smelled of wet pine and memory. I sat on the same wooden steps where we had once laughed as boys, opened the old notebook, and wrote my reply. Patrick, that house was never gone. It's been waiting for you to open the door. The next morning, a small story appeared at the bottom of the business section. Peter Hayes revives Haven House, a project to build homes for orphaned children. At the end of the article, they quoted my words, "I build homes for children without families, because I almost lost my own." Weeks later, Patrick's letter was read aloud during a charity event broadcast nationwide. As I read his words to the audience, many wept openly, not for tragedy, but for the fragile, stubborn hope that still lived between two brothers. One viewer left a comment that went viral. "No wall is too thick to block the light, if someone dares to open their heart." And it was true, light had found its way back. To me, to Ethan, to the company, even to Patrick. Because in the end, justice hadn't only punished a crime, it had awakened a soul. 3 years passed since the verdict that ended it all. Time, the thing I once blamed for destroying everything, had turned out to be the one force capable of healing. Hayes' Sons was alive again, stronger than ever. The Haven House project had built more than 20 homes for orphans. And on the main lobby wall, I'd hung my father's words once more. A home stands firm only when it's built on honesty. But there was one place I hadn't returned to, Maple Lake. Until one crisp October morning when Alan walked into my office with a small envelope and said quietly, "The federal court approved the appeal. Patrick's sentence has been reduced. He's being released for good behavior. They'd like you to attend the official hearing." For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. 3 years, too short for a man who betrayed everything, too long for a soul that had finally awakened. The courtroom that day was nearly empty. No cameras, no reporters, just the faint hum of the air vents. Patrick stood before the judge, thin, hair streaked with gray, his posture fragile but upright. Judge Everett, the same man who had seen our family fall apart, spoke gently. During his sentence, inmate Patrick Hayes demonstrated consistent reform. He has counseled others on ethics and responsibility. In light of these actions, his remaining term is commuted to probation. "Mr. Hayes, you are free." Patrick didn't cry. He only nodded, then turned to meet my eyes. I smiled. There was nothing left to say. Everything worth saying had already been written in that letter he'd sent me years before. A month later, the phone rang. "Peter," he said softly, "I'm back at Maple Lake." The sound of his voice, tired but steady, stayed with me all the way through the 4-hour drive north. When I arrived, the sun was melting into the horizon, spilling gold across the quiet water. The old cabin stood there again, restored, windows repaired, porch swept clean, the scent of pine and wood smoke in the air. The front door was open. Patrick stood at the porch, a cup of coffee in his hands, smiling faintly. "I kept my promise," he said. Inside, the place was almost unchanged. The same wooden steps, the same creaking floorboards. He pointed toward the corner where our father's photo hung. Beneath it, he had nailed a small plaque carved from maple wood. "Haven, where two wings meet again." We sat on the porch in silence, the lake breathing beside us. Finally, Patrick spoke. "Do you still hate me?" I shook my head. "No. I just regret how long it took us to learn that love takes more courage than hate." He smiled faintly, eyes wet. "I learned that inside. he said. Watching men who'd lost everything made me realize you never wanted to take anything from me. You just wanted to save what was left of us. I put a hand on his shoulder. Light, but enough for him to know that the past was gone, buried under the soil of forgiveness. As twilight deepened, we built a small fire by the lake, the same spot where Father once taught us to carve our first wooden boat. Patrick reached into a box and pulled out two unfinished pieces of wood. One read Peter, the other Patrick. He never finished carving these before he died, Patrick said quietly. I saved them for today. We sat together, tools in hand, completing the final line Father never got to write. Brothers by truth, not by blood. Sparks leapt from the fire, drifting into the dusk like tiny stars. Patrick gazed across the lake, his voice low but sure. Father was right. Buildings can fall, companies can vanish, but as long as we can look each other in the eye without shame, the Hayes name still stands. I didn't answer. I just stood, watching the still water reflect our silhouettes. No victor, no victim, just two brothers who had walked through fire and found their way home. When I finally turned to leave, Patrick said, I'll stay here. Teach the local kids how to build models. Come by whenever you want. I nodded. Before getting into the car, I looked back. He was standing in the doorway, framed by the soft orange glow of the firelight. As the tires crunched over the gravel, a cool breeze swept off the lake, carrying with it the scent of new timber and smoke. I whispered into the wind, as if speaking to my father. I kept the house, Dad, not with concrete, but with forgiveness. Above the water, the last light of day stretched across the lake like a ribbon of gold, splitting, joining again, two halves of the same reflection, two wings, finally home. When Patrick Hayes walked out of the federal prison, no cameras followed him, no headlines, no crowd waiting at the gates. Just a single guard, an old veteran with tired eyes, handing him a scratched silver ring, the only thing Patrick had kept when he was arrested. You're free now, Hayes, the guard said, voice rough but kind. Don't waste it this time. Patrick said nothing. He simply closed his fingers around the ring and looked up. For the first time in 3 years, sunlight touched his face without being filtered through bars. It was blinding, but it was warm. He didn't go back to Manhattan. Instead, he boarded the only northbound bus that left the city that morning, the one heading toward Maple Lake, where the mountains still guarded the quiet waters of his childhood. On that bus, no one recognized him. No one whispered, "That's Patrick Hayes." The name once splashed across every paper in America. Now, he was just a middle-aged man with tired eyes, wearing an old coat and the weight of too many mistakes. When the bus stopped at the rural depot, the air smelled of pine and rain. The lake glimmered in the distance, calm, patient, as if it had been waiting for him. The cabin stood where it always had, and on the wooden table inside there was a folded note with my brother's handwriting. This house is yours now, Patrick. There's a small patch of land out back. I've already spoken to the town council. You can use it to open a workshop for the orphans in Haven House. If you can, start over. Right here, where we once lost everything. At the bottom was my father's old saying, written in Peter's hand. Don't wait for life to be perfect before you rebuild, because forgiveness itself is construction. Patrick sank to the floor, clutching the letter. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the realization that someone, after everything, still believed he could be good. The first weeks were quiet. He lived simply, mending the roof, chopping firewood, cooking alone. The locals kept their distance, except for a few curious children who wandered over to see the man from TV. He didn't send them away. Instead, he laughed, genuinely, and handed them paper and glue, teaching them how to build tiny houses out of popsicle sticks, just like he and Peter used to do when they were boys by the lake. One little boy asked, "Mister, were you poor like us when you were a kid?" Patrick smiled faintly, eyes distant. "No, I had everything, but I lost it all, because I didn't know how to be grateful." The kids didn't really understand, but they laughed anyway, and for the first time in years Patrick laughed with them, a laugh free of masks, of pride, of guilt. Word began to spread about the old teacher by Maple Lake. Locals called him Mr. P. No one mentioned his past anymore. They only saw a quiet man who sat on the porch every morning with a cup of tea, staring out at the water before walking to the small shed where he taught children to saw, measure, and, as he called it, build honest houses. One day, a local reporter visited for an interview. "Mr. Hayes," she asked, "do you ever regret what happened?" Patrick smiled softly. "Not just regret. I'm grateful, because if I hadn't fallen, I never would have learned how to stand up for someone other than myself." The reporter blinked, caught off guard. "And aren't you afraid people will never forget what you did?" Patrick's voice deepened, steady but gentle. "They don't have to forget. I only hope they see that a person can change, if given the chance." That short interview aired on a Sunday night. Within days, hundreds of letters arrived at the little mailbox by the lake, people thanking him, forgiving him, or simply saying his words gave them hope. They called him the man who rebuilt his conscience. That night, Patrick sat at his small desk and began to write again, this time not to the world, but to his brother. "Peter, I've started over. For real this time. These children teach me more than any book ever did. They remind me that people don't need to trust you right away. They just need to see that you're trying. I don't know how much time I have left, but for the first time, I wake up feeling human, not like a name on a headline." He folded the letter and placed it beside the old pocket watch their father once carried, the same one Peter had mailed him. Its ticking filled the silence, soft and steady, like a heartbeat returning after a long sleep. Patrick looked out toward the lake, whispered into the night, "Father, I've started rebuilding my house." And under the quiet stars of Maple Lake, for the first time in a long, long while, he truly had. A year after his release, Patrick's little woodworking shed by Maple Lake had transformed into a small community training center, built not with money, but with kindness. The door was still crooked, the desks uneven, but every afternoon at least 20 children gathered there, calling him by the name they'd given him, Teacher Pat. He taught them how to measure, to sketch, to build model houses. When a child made a mistake, he never raised his voice. Instead, he would kneel beside them, guiding their hands. "You know," he'd say, smiling, "the first house I ever built collapsed after 3 months, because I was too proud to listen to advice. Don't make the same mistake." The children laughed, then tried again, determined to build what they called honest houses. None of them knew who Patrick had once been. They only knew him as the quiet man with steady eyes who believed that every wall, even one made of sticks, should be built with care. One golden autumn afternoon, as sunlight shimmered on the lake, a car stopped outside the gate. Patrick was repairing the porch roof when he heard a soft voice behind him. "Uncle Pat?" He turned. The young man standing there was tall, composed, and hauntingly familiar. "I'm Ethan," he said quietly. "Peter Hayes's son." Patrick froze. The world fell silent for a heartbeat. Memories flooded back. The courtroom lights, Peter's weary eyes, the word guilty. His throat tightened. "Ethan, you've grown. I never thought I'd be worthy of seeing you." The young man shook his head. "You hurt my father's name, but he told me, if you ever find the courage to forgive, see your uncle first." Patrick bowed his head, tears falling freely. "He still believes in me?" He said, "Truth already punished your uncle, son. You don't need to." The word struck deep, not like a wound, but like a release. Patrick invited Ethan in. They talked for hours, about Peter, about childhood, about the house by the lake that had outlived both pride and pain. When Ethan finally stood to leave, he clasped Patrick's hand. "I don't know if you believe in God, Uncle," he said softly, "but I think my father prayed for this day." Patrick could only nod, unable to speak. He simply bowed, not in shame this time, but in reverence for grace. Ethan's visit didn't stay secret for long. A local journalist heard about the former magnate teaching orphans by the lake and asked to film a short segment. Patrick hesitated, then agreed, not to justify himself, but to say thank you. The camera crew arrived on a clear morning. Patrick wore his work shirt, hands stained with paint, his face etched by time, but his eyes calm. "Mr. Hayes," the reporter asked, "do you ever fear people will always see you as a traitor?" Patrick smiled faintly. "I once lived for reputation, and I lost it. Now I live for truth. It's smaller, quieter, but it's mine." And what would you tell people who've made terrible mistakes? Patrick thought for a long moment. That mistakes don't end a life. They end the version of you that refused to change. As long as you can teach a child to build something honest, you still matter. The segment aired on a Sunday night. Within days, donations poured in. Volunteers offered tools, wood, paint. The world no longer saw Patrick the disgraced. They saw a man rebuilding others, and himself. One evening, Ethan returned, carrying a large framed photograph. Peter and Patrick as young men, smiling by the lake, and a carved wooden plaque that read, Hayes Foundation, for children who deserve an honest start. Patrick's hands trembled. Ethan, what is this? My father asked me to bring it. The Haven House Fund will support your center now. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Patrick stood frozen, then broke down, the first tears of joy he'd allowed himself in nearly a decade. The children rushed over, worried their teacher was hurt, while Ethan just smiled gently. It's okay, he said. That's what people look like when they've truly been forgiven. That night, Patrick sat on the porch, writing in his father's old journal. Today, I am no longer the villain in the story. I am simply a man rebuilding himself, one brick of remorse, one smile of a child at a time. Outside, the moon rippled across the lake's surface, calm and silver. Patrick closed his eyes, whispered into the night, Thank you, Peter, for not giving up on the part of me that was still human. And for the first time, the reflection in the lake didn't look like a ghost of the past, but the quiet shape of a man finally at peace. 15 years later, Maple Lake was as still as ever. But locals said that if you passed by at dawn, you might see an old man with silver hair sitting on the wooden dock, a cup of tea in his hand, surrounded by laughing children hammering bits of wood together. His name was Patrick Hayes, once branded a traitor, now lovingly known as the builder of honest houses. The small workshop had grown into the Hayes Foundation, a community trade school with hundreds of students across the state. Patrick still taught every week, though his strength was fading. He no longer spoke about his past, only about his father, the man who taught his sons to build with truth. One crisp autumn afternoon, Patrick sat on the porch watching the children paint a wall, golden yellow. A little girl tugged his sleeve. Teacher Pat, who was the first house you ever built for? Patrick smiled, his voice soft and raspy. For someone I hurt the most, and who taught me how to forgive. The girl tilted her head, puzzled, then skipped away. Patrick watched her go, whispering to the quiet air, Peter, if you could see these children, you'd know I've really come home. That winter, his heart condition returned. He could no longer teach, though he insisted on sitting by the window during every class. Ethan Salm, now the director of the Haven House Foundation, came often to visit. One afternoon, Patrick took his hand, voice trembling. Ethan, when I'm gone, no statues, no ceremonies, just keep the classroom alive, and when each child finishes their first house, tell them to write one word on the wall, truth. Ethan nodded, eyes wet. I promise, Uncle Pat. Patrick smiled faintly. That's enough. I've owed your father my whole life, and now I've finally repaid it. News of Patrick's passing reached Peter on a quiet February morning. He was in his office preparing for a keynote on business ethics when a letter from Ethan arrived. Just one simple line, Uncle Pat is gone. The lake is still, like glass. Peter froze. He canceled all his appointments and drove north for hours through the snow to the lake that had once held both their childhood and their reconciliation. When he arrived, the wooden cabin still stood, warm light flickering from the hearth. On the table beside their father's old photograph lay a sealed envelope, its handwriting shaky but familiar. The front read, To my brother. Peter opened it. Inside was Patrick's final letter. Dear Peter, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. But don't grieve. I didn't die in regret. I lived in gratitude. Thank you for not letting go, even when the world did. Thank you for letting me rebuild, not a company, but my soul. When you look at this lake, don't see guilt anymore. See two boys laughing again, building their first house out of popsicle sticks. And if you can, tell the world this. Everyone deserves forgiveness. They just need to begin with one kind act. Your brother, Patrick. Peter's tears blurred the ink. He stepped outside, gazing across the shimmering lake where sunlight danced like 1,000 shards of glass. Memories flooded back. Their father's voice, their laughter, the years of loss, and the moment of grace. He walked down to the dock and sat where Patrick used to sit. From his coat, he took out a small glass case containing the miniature house they'd built as boys. He placed it gently on the water and let it drift. This one's for you, Patrick. Rest easy, brother. You finally built the house that lasts. The wind stirred. Ripples spread across the lake, carrying the tiny house farther and farther until it vanished into the golden reflection of sunset. Peter closed his eyes. Tears fell, but they were light, not of sorrow, but of peace. The peace both brothers had spent a lifetime searching for. A year later, visitors to the Maple Lake Vocational Center noticed a new bronze plaque on the wall. It read, "In memory of Patrick Hayes, 1968 to 2035, who taught us that justice is not punishment, it's the chance to become kind again." Beneath it, in smaller letters, Peter had added, "Family is not made of blood, but of respect and love." When the wind blew, it whispered across the lake, stirring faint echoes of laughter, two boys by the water, still building together. And somewhere, beyond the clouds and the noise of the world, two brothers named Hayes were once again side by side, raising new walls on a foundation made entirely of forgiveness. At first, prison was hell for Patrick, not because of the chains or the freezing walls, but because of the silence. Silence drove him insane. It made every lie he'd ever told echo back at him, louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. Inside those four walls, no one called him Director Hayes or the financial prodigy anymore. He was just inmate 23491, a number, a shadow. A man who once thought he could control the world, now unable to control the nightmares inside his own head. That first night, Patrick dreamed the Hayes Sons building was collapsing. He stood in the wreckage, clutching his father's old blueprints. Across the rubble stood Peter, the brother he'd betrayed, watching in silence. Patrick screamed, "Peter, I just wanted to feel like I mattered." But Peter turned away. His voice echoed faintly through the smoke. "Value doesn't come from taking what isn't yours." Patrick woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. A weak yellow light spilled through the cracks of the cell door, glinting off the tiny mirror on the wall. For the first time, he looked straight at himself, the hollow cheeks, the tired eyes, the wrinkles carved deep by guilt. He whispered, "What have you become, Patrick?" Days blurred into each other. No one spoke to him, except one man, Marcus, his cellmate, a former priest imprisoned for covering up another's crime. One night, Marcus asked softly, "Do you believe in redemption, Patrick?" Patrick let out a bitter laugh. "Redemption? For what? For betraying my brother? For shaming my father? Or for destroying myself?" Marcus studied him quietly, then said, "No, not for them, for God. If you still believe, and if you don't, then for the truth." Patrick smirked. "The truth? The truth already killed me." Marcus replied calmly, "No, the truth only destroys what was built on lies. If you start rebuilding with it, it might just save you." The words fell into Patrick's heart like a seed landing on dry soil. He didn't respond. But that night, for the first time, he knelt, not to pray, but to listen. Time crawled. Each tick of the clock was a sentence served. Every night brought new ghosts. Sometimes he saw his father, standing in the yard, silent and disappointed. Sometimes it was Peter, whispering through the dark, "You killed me, Patrick." Each time Patrick woke trembling, clutching his head, whispering through the tears, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." No one heard. One morning, Marcus put a hand on his shoulder. "Who are you saying sorry to?" Patrick rasped, "My brother. In my dreams." Marcus smiled faintly. "Then say it in the waking world. Write it." Patrick began to write. The first letters he sent were intercepted by the guards, so he wrote more, not begging for forgiveness, but confessing. He wrote about the fear, the jealousy, the years spent staring through the doorway as his father embraced Peter. "I spent my whole life in your shadow, Peter, and to escape it I burned down the only house we ever shared." He stopped for a moment, hands shaking, then continued, "But when the house was gone, I realized you never kept the light for yourself. You were shielding it so the flame of this family wouldn't go out. The letters were never mailed. He hid them beneath his pillow until the night Marcus was transferred to another prison. Patrick handed him the notebook. If anyone asks, tell them I finally understood. Marcus asked, understood what? Patrick smiled, eyes wet but peaceful. That guilt never disappears, but it can turn into something good if you're brave enough to face it. From that day forward, Patrick changed. He volunteered to teach other inmates to read. He repaired broken benches in the woodshop. He wrote letters for prisoners who couldn't write their own. One young man asked him, "You doing this to make up for what you did?" Patrick shook his head. "No, I do it to remember that every time I help someone, I stop myself from hurting anyone else." On his second Christmas behind bars, Patrick dreamed again. His father stood by Maple Lake, bathed in pale moonlight. "Son," his father said, "the house you built fell because you refused to listen. Tell me, have you learned to listen now?" Patrick nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, father, I'm listening." His father smiled gently. "Good, then rebuild it. This time, with truth." Patrick awoke to sunlight spilling through the bars, casting bright lines across the cold floor. For the first time in years, he smiled, not because he'd been forgiven, but because he knew deep down he had finally begun again. 2 years into his sentence, Patrick had become someone new, someone the entire prison called with quiet respect. Mr. Hayes, the teacher. No one remembered his past anymore. They only knew that behind those cold steel bars lived a man with gray hair and calm eyes, a man who taught reading, arithmetic, and morality through his own story. In the mornings, he helped young inmates write letters to their mothers. In the afternoons, he repaired broken chairs in the library, carving 3 simple words into each piece of wood: "Truth builds." And every night, he sat alone at his small desk, writing in a notebook. Not prayers, not regrets, just records of small, decent things he'd done that day, proof that he was still alive. One late afternoon, the guard handed him a clean, worn envelope. The sender's name was printed neatly on the corner: Peter Hayes. Patrick froze. His hands trembled like a boy receiving his first letter from his father. He sat down on the wooden stool, took a deep breath, and opened it. "Patrick, I read what you wrote. Marcus brought them to me. I didn't reply sooner, not because I was angry, but because I was afraid. Afraid my words might stop you before you truly began to change. But now I see. You've already begun. I don't want to speak about the past anymore. I just want you to know I'm still here. Not as the shadow you once imagined, but as someone who finally sees you standing again, piece by piece. Patrick, you don't need my forgiveness. You only need to believe you're still worthy of love. Because if you don't believe that, every act of redemption will just become another punishment you give yourself." Peter. Patrick read it again and again. Each word sank deep, slow but steady. He stopped at one line: "You don't need my forgiveness." For a long time he stared at it, motionless. Something shifted inside him. Not pain, not shame, but a strange, gentle peace. For years he had searched in all the wrong places. He kept waiting for someone else to erase his sins, forgetting that true forgiveness begins when a man accepts that he was wrong, and still chooses to live with honesty. From that day on, Patrick changed once more. He began teaching the young inmates how to rewrite their own stories, not to justify, but to begin anew. He told them, "I used to think success would earn me respect, but real respect only comes when you can stand before others, admit your mistakes, and still live with decency." Some men sat quietly, tears dripping onto their paper. One whispered, "If someone like you can change, maybe I can too." Patrick didn't answer. He just smiled and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, like someone who had fallen into the abyss and now reached down to pull another up. One night, when the power went out across the prison, Patrick sat in the yard, staring at the pitch-black sky. No stars, only a thin beam of light from a distant watchtower. Marcus, the old priest, now transferred back to his wing, came and sat beside him. "So," he asked softly, "do you believe in redemption now, Patrick?" Patrick nodded. "I don't just believe in it, I live by it." Marcus smiled. "And forgiveness. Do you think you've been forgiven?" Patrick was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "I don't think I need anyone to forgive me anymore, because I've forgiven myself. Marcus's hand tightened on his shoulder. That's the lesson even God hopes every man will learn. Time in prison no longer felt like punishment. It became a space, a quiet sanctuary for healing. Patrick wrote dozens of letters to Peter, but this time they weren't about guilt. He wrote about small things, about a boy who could finally write his own name, about a young inmate who promised to work for Hayes' Sons when he got out, about his dreams of Maple Lake, no longer full of smoke, but shimmering under silver moonlight. One letter ended with a single line, "Peter, I may never reclaim the years I've lost, but I'm rebuilding my soul, one brick at a time, and this time it won't collapse." On his final day in prison, the warden handed Patrick a small object, his father's old silver watch. "Still ticking," the guard said. Patrick turned it over in his hand. The second hand moved steady, patient, like a heartbeat. He smiled faintly. "Yeah, it's still running, just like time, just like people, if someone gives them another chance." When Patrick stepped out through the prison gates, morning light streamed through the fence. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. No reporters, no applause, no one waiting, only the sound of a single bird greeting the dawn, and his heartbeat, steady and alive. Inside, he whispered, "Peter, I've walked through my sins, and for the first time, I'm not afraid of the light anymore." That was the moment Patrick truly awakened. No longer the villain, no longer the victim, just a man, finally honest, finally free, and in that moment he knew, life can take away your name, your freedom, even your time, but no one can take away your right to begin again. Patrick turned north toward Maple Lake, where a small wooden house still stood waiting for him, a quiet reminder that it's never too late, and that redemption will always be the shortest road home. A year after Patrick's passing, the story of the Hayes brothers swept across America, no longer as sensational headlines, but as a moral parable retold in classrooms, leadership seminars, and corporate ethics conferences. The New York Times ran a two-page feature titled, "The Brothers Who Proved That Justice is Not an Ending, but the Beginning of Humanity." The article recounted everything, from Patrick's betrayal and Peter's fall from grace to the day they reunited beside the quiet waters of Maple Lake. There was no judgment in its tone, just a calm narration, interwoven with old photographs, two boys beside a wooden cabin, and two old men holding hands under a fading sunset. A professor at Harvard wrote in Ethics Leadership Quarterly, "In a world where success is often measured by wealth and power, Peter Hayes proved that the true measure of a man lies in how he treats the one who hurt him most." The quote spread like wildfire. Major corporations began referencing the Hayes Principle in their ethics training programs. No success can stand on lies, and no adversary deserves more respect than the truth. When Peter was invited to speak at the International Forum on Ethics and Social Justice in Geneva, he appeared with silver hair and a calm, resonant voice. Behind him, the screen showed a photo of Patrick smiling. Beneath it, the words, "Forgiveness is the foundation of truth." Peter spoke slowly, his tone steady yet deeply human. "Many have asked why I forgave my brother. I don't have a perfect answer. I only know this. If that day I had chosen hatred over forgiveness, I would still be a prisoner inside my own heart." The hall fell completely silent. A journalist later described the moment. "Peter Hayes didn't speak like a public figure. He spoke like a man who had walked through the ashes and emerged holding a fragment of light." After that speech, thousands of letters arrived at the Haven House Foundation. One man wrote, "Because of the Hayes brothers, I called my brother again after 10 years of silence." A young woman from Texas wrote, "I used to think justice meant making the guilty pay. Now I understand. Real justice is making your heart right again." Peter read those letters each night before bed. He didn't cry. He smiled, because he knew Patrick was still alive, not in body, but in every act of kindness sparked by their story. That April, the United Nations held a ceremony honoring those who had inspired the world through compassion and truth. Among the names engraved on a bronze memorial stood Peter Patrick Hayes. The spokesperson declared, "These two brothers did not change the world with money or power, but with the strength of truth and forgiveness." Peter stood quietly before the plaque, bathed in the amber glow of the afternoon sun. He placed a single white tulip beside Patrick's name and whispered, "You see, Patrick, in the end, We did build the house Father dreamed of, a house made of truth that will never fall again. 2 years after the memorial, Peter had quietly stepped away from the business world. He handed full control of the company to his son, Ethan, once a son who resented his father, now the man carrying forward the Hayes legacy. Instead of attending board meetings or corporate galas, Peter spent his days traveling across the country, from small towns in Kentucky to struggling suburbs of Detroit, where modest homes stood proudly under a single sign, Haven House. Each home bore an inscription, carved by Ethan himself, dedicated to Patrick Hayes, who rebuilt a home with honesty. The volunteers of the Hayes Foundation were not philanthropists or CEOs. Most were people who had once lost their way, ex-convicts, recovering addicts, or orphans who had grown up without a roof to call their own. Now they were the torchbearers of a story that proved redemption was real. They told Patrick's story wherever they went, not as a tragedy, but as a testament that a fallen man can still become a light for others. At a dedication ceremony in Atlanta, Peter was invited to cut the ribbon for the 500th Haven House. As the applause echoed through the crowd, a middle-aged black woman stepped forward, holding a small oil painting in her trembling hands. "My name is Rosa," she said, her voice breaking. "I was one of the kids Mr. Patrick taught by Maple Lake. Back then, I thought I'd never escape poverty, but he told me, if you build with honesty, your house will stand forever. Today I brought you this painting. Because of him, I became an architect." Peter's hands shook as he accepted the gift. The painting depicted Maple Lake at sunset, two wings touching in midair, bathed in golden light. Beneath it, a line was written, "Forgiveness builds forever." The entire hall rose to their feet, not cheering, but applauding in reverent silence. Peter bowed deeply, tears falling onto the wooden frame. His travels continued. Every place he visited, he collected a fragment of Patrick's legacy, a handwritten note, a wooden model, or simply a quiet thank you. They came from the people Patrick had once helped, a former inmate now running a workshop for troubled youth, a young teacher building vocational schools, a boy who once received his first set of drawing tools from the foundation. One night, as they drove through the Midwest, Ethan turned to his father and asked, "Do you ever wonder if Uncle Pat can see all this?" Peter smiled faintly. "I don't wonder, son. I know." Ethan frowned. "How can you be so sure?" Peter looked out the window, watching the lights fade into the horizon. "Because everything he planted is blooming, and when kindness blooms, the soul that sowed it never dies." Later that year, at the Haven House Anniversary Gala in Washington, D.C., Ethan surprised everyone by announcing the Hayes Scholarship, a grant for orphans who dreamed of becoming architects. At the center of the stage stood Patrick's portrait framed between two white candles. Peter stepped forward, his hand trembling as he touched his brother's photo. He whispered softly, "Patrick, you taught me that justice doesn't end in a courtroom. It lives on, in every act of kindness that follows." The hall fell silent under the warm light. A little girl walked up shyly, handing Peter a tiny wooden model of a house. Inside, scrawled in pencil, were the words, "For Mr. Pat, the man who built kindness." Peter held it close, tears streaming down his face. And in that moment, he knew. Patrick's compassion had never faded. It had simply passed on, from one pair of hands to hundreds to thousands of hearts, still learning how to build with love. It was a quiet winter afternoon when Peter returned to Maple Lake, the place where everything had started, and where it would finally come to rest. Mist drifted softly across the water like a silk veil. Patrick's wooden cabin still stood there, simple, warm, untouched, as if no storm had ever passed through its walls. Peter sat down on the old porch steps, holding a small notebook, the same one he and Patrick once used as children to sketch houses made of popsicle sticks. The first page had yellowed with age, but Patrick's childish handwriting was still there. "Nothing can ever come between us." Peter smiled faintly and whispered, as if his brother were still somewhere nearby, "We kept that promise, Patrick, even if it took a lifetime." The sun began to set, spilling amber light across the lake and tinting the little cabin in gold. Peter took out a small voice recorder, the same one he used during speeches, and pressed record. But this time he didn't speak for the world. He spoke for himself, for Patrick, for anyone who had ever been broken and needed to believe again. "Someone once asked me, "Don't you hate your brother after everything he did to you?" And I said, "No. Because hatred is just another kind of prison, one you build inside your own heart. I lost everything once, my name, my family, the trust of those I loved. But in the ashes of it all, I found something far greater, the strength to forgive. Patrick made terrible mistakes, but we both learned that a man is not defined by his sins. He's defined by how he faces them." Peter paused, gazing out at the darkening reflection of the sky on the water. Justice isn't about making someone pay. It's about truth being seen and compassion being reborn. I didn't forgive Patrick to protect the past. I forgave him to save the future, mine, my family's, and for every child still learning what it means to be human. The wind stirred, flipping the pages of the old notebook. Peter glanced down at Patrick's final words, written years ago in his last letter. "If you can, tell the world this, that anyone can be forgiven, so long as they begin with one kind act." Peter closed the notebook gently and said in a low voice, "You were right, Patrick. The world doesn't need perfect people. It needs people brave enough to change." He walked to the edge of the lake, scooped a handful of fine sand, and scattered it into the water, letting it slip through his fingers like the remnants of a burden finally released. "Family isn't made of blood," he whispered. "It's made of respect and love. Thank you, Patrick, for teaching me that." The last trace of sunlight dissolved across the lake, leaving behind a faint shimmer, like the wings of two birds still flying together, never apart. And if you've ever been hurt, if you've ever lost your faith in people, remember this: no wound is beyond healing. Only hearts that refuse to open stay unhealed. Let the story of the Hayes brothers remind you that forgiveness doesn't make you weak. It sets you free. Because in the end, as Peter once said, we don't choose who becomes our family, but we can always choose how we love them, with respect and with kindness. Follow this journey, because the next stories will reach even deeper into your heart, where truth, justice, and humanity meet.